just our former foster youth. I was always very vocal in the room. And sometimes, some of our organizations at the time, especially in the early 2000s when I was starting my career, equity wasn't at the forefront of the conversations. And so it was really a challenging time for me in my career because I oftentimes felt very frustrated by the system. And so I remember, as I moved into leadership roles and I learned how to navigate different spaces, I had to, it was easy for me to always talk about equity, but when it came to racial equity specifically, I would get really nervous. My voice would tremble. This might be TMI, but I would sweat. It was uncomfortable. And I had to really learn to move through that discomfort so that I could really to be the leader I wanted to be able to have the focused conversations on race, even in spaces where it wasn't comfortable or welcomed. And so, I offer that reflection because I think, we have to do some personal self-reflection at the forefront and really thinking about, if we are going to be equity leaders and specifically racial equity leaders, what are the tools we need to empower ourselves with? Who are the people we need to surround ourselves with? Because at the end of the day, I can tell you from my own lived experiences that, racial equity will not happen without intentionality. You have to be intentional about it. And so I just offer that little point of reflection as we move into today's presentation. Oops. So one of the things I like to do, whether I'm mentoring a student or talking to my own students at Long Beach City College or working alongside colleagues, I oftentimes talk about this concept of understanding our why. And as a leader, as I mentioned at the beginning, it can be hard to be an equity warrior. It can be isolating at times. You can feel unsupported by either colleagues or even the institution itself at different moments in time and space. And so oftentimes, I always say you have to really be anchored in your why, and you have to understand your why and what really is that the why beneath the why in terms of the work that you do. And so I offer you these two photos because for me, this is my personal why. The photo on the left is, and I don't know why I always get really emotional when I show the slide, but is me with my young daughter when I became a single father. And I was sitting in front of my grandmother. This is taken in my grandma's front yard in Whittier. And I felt so lost. I was, dealing with so many things. I was dealing with housing insecurity, food insecurity. I had an infant child with me. I was dealing with coming to terms with my own sexual orientation by being gay and coming out. And there was just so much happening at once. And the one thing that I remember at that time is that despite all those challenges, all those feelings of all those insecurities and negative feelings I was feeling, the one thing that I kind of always kept in the forefront of my mind is that if I went back to school, I could make a better life for myself and for my daughter. And so initially what drove me to school and to enroll in community college was this desire to build a better life for myself and for my daughter. But it was really kind of focused around this idea of being able to get a high paying job, or at least a job with living wage, right? But something happened more than that. It was my community college education for me was not just this, like I went to school and it was transactional and then I got a better job. It was a place where I felt personally liberated, where I not only, grew as an academic scholar and, was eventually able to transfer to UC Irvine and then went on and got a master's and doctorate. But it was a place where I really began to understand myself, my identities, that really kind of shaped me as a human being. And it was a place where I felt my confidence was grew and nurtured. And so for me, I think about that 19-year-old Mike all the time as a leader. And it's with me every day. And so I always ask myself a very important question. And this is where I draw the connections of, this is my personal why, right? Going back to my daughter and myself and that experience, and then connecting my personal why to Long Beach City College's collective why, right? And so now as the president of the college, and I'm in this tremendous position to create such deep impact, right? For students and for faculty and staff, I ask myself these very important questions when I'm making leadership decisions. How will my decision impact students? And then the secondary question is, how will this decision impact our most vulnerable students, our housing insecure, our former foster youth, our formerly incarcerated, our dreamers, I'm always asking myself that question because I want to try to situate myself back in that 19-year-old self. How would this institutional decision have impacted me and my daughter on my educational journey? And so that's how I connect my personal why to our collective why. And so what I want to challenge you all to think about again, because I really do believe self-reflection is an important tool in equity work, is that you think about what your personal why is and how that connects to our collective why in this work. And then, that be your North Star. Because like I said, there are going to be moments where you're going to be challenged. You're going to question, am I doing the right thing? This is tough, and so this is tough work. And so I want to, offer you that because when my spirit feels challenged or I'm feeling fatigued, I go back to my why. And I think that's been a big source for me. And I share that with others because hopefully through that process of self-reflection, it can be a source for you as well. So, and then the picture on the right is my daughter graduating with her bachelor's degree from Whittier College. And I'm actually really proud to say she not only graduated with her bachelor's degree, but she has her master's degree now from San Diego State. And she's teaching at San Diego State and Cuyamaca College. She teaches English. And so I'm very proud of her. And she did that all at 23 years old. And I mean, just, for me, I think about what education gave me, but also not just me, but my daughter. And so considering, where we came from together. And so I'm just really proud of her. So again, I offer that as a point of reflection, just understanding your why and being anchored in it. And keep reminders of it. You need those visual representations and reminders. So the next slide is, again, I want to talk a little bit now more specifically about Long Beach City College and our journey. One of the things on the outset that I want to frame, because I think this is like really important, is that yes, I get to be the president of the college. And yes, I get to be oftentimes the spokesperson to a lot of the amazing things that are happening at Long Beach City College. But at the end of the day, we all know this work is not a reflection of me or one person. It's about the collective. It really is about the testament of hundreds of people who come to Long Beach City College every day and put students first and work incredibly hard to make Long Beach City College a more equitable learning institution. And it's also, we stand on the shoulders of folks and different equity warriors who fought for decades to advance a culture of equity at Long Beach City College. So I want to, say that because I think it's really important that I get to sit here and share some of the impact and some of this great work. But I really want to make sure that folks understand that we don't do this work alone. And it's really about a community that we build that is focused on equity leadership and equity practice. And so I just wanted to offer that. So if you haven't heard, Long Beach City College has been in the news a lot lately for a lot of our advancement in equity work. Back in June, we received a historic gift of $30 million from Mackenzie Scott. We've gotten a lot of attention for our safe parking program. We recently just were awarded the first grant in the country from the Department of Education in partnership with USC, almost $1 million to build a pathway to higher education for gang-affiliated youth or gang-associated youth, I should say. And so we are really been working extremely hard to really create a culture of care and just equity at Long Beach City College, rooted in equity. And so there's, I think, two really powerful moments on our journey of equity awareness and awakening at Long Beach City College that I want to kind of anchor ourselves in. So the first is, I arrived probably about close to 4 years ago now at Long Beach City College, and the timing couldn't have been better because when I arrived, we recently had just participated in what's called the USC Center for Urban Education's analysis of statewide equity plans. And so if you don't know and you're not familiar with the California Community College system, we essentially are required by law to submit a student equity plan every few years. And so we had just completed our equity plan. And so USC decided to do the statewide analysis. And so as they analyzed Long Beach's plan, they did some keyword searches. And they just simple keyword searches, and they would search for words like Black or African-American, Latino or Latinx, Cambodian. And so they started looking for different racial identities. And what they found was that our equity plan was essentially very much colorblind. So we had these equity practices and strategies in place, but they were not necessarily race conscious. And so that was, I think, a big aha moment for me as a leader, because, what I always say is data is great, but data is only as good as what you do with it. And so I was sitting there with this report that was glaringly, calling us out, to be honest with you, as an institution. And I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do with this? I also recognized I was a new leader. I always tell folks we move at the speed of trust. And so folks didn't really know me. So I'm, to jump right into saying, okay, we need to move towards racial equity and become more race conscious. I knew that was going to be a professional risk for me. But I felt like it was really important to recognize that, for those of us that aspire for these leadership roles, I really firmly believe that many of us, we're not motivated by title or prestige, we're motivated by impact. And many of us worked very hard and fought very hard. Those of us, I'm very open. I'm first generation college. I'm Latino. I'm queer. I don't necessarily fit the profile of a president. I come from student services, and so I recognize all these things. And so I think it's really important that, for me as a leader, I had to self-reflect and say, okay, did I, strive to get into these roles to maintain the status quo, or am I here to uplift and create transformational change? And so I really landed on, okay, this is my moment. I need to really look at this report and I need to do something about it. And so I was very fortunate that, I brought this report back. I was co-chair, I should say, of a student success committee on campus. And we were able to work together with our faculty, with our staff, and really sit down and have a really meaningful conversation about what does it mean to have an equity plan that's predominantly colorblind? And how do we move beyond colorblind practices into a space that's more race conscious? And then there was another powerful moment. And I think, all of us on a national level, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, murders, I should say, I think that was a very impactful moment in Long Beach. We know the protests happened, our students were hurt, our faculty and staff were hurting, and specifically, our Black colleagues and our Black students were hurting deeply. And so I think, that was also another pivotal moment as an institution, that it was like, okay, we started some of these conversations around the equity plan and what it means to move beyond colorblind to race conscious. Then I think, another tipping point was, okay, people are done with the performative speeches. People are done with the talking about equity and racial equity specifically. We need to see real change. We need to see action. And so I think those were two powerful moments on our college's campus, on our college campuses, racial equity awareness. And so then our board essentially took a call to action, and they adopted what is called a framework for reconciliation. And they gave our college essentially a framework to work through that would hopefully move us through these stages that will ultimately land us in a place where racial equity will not just be something that's performative or talked about, but that actually has real concrete steps that we can hold ourselves accountable to as an institution. So I want to ground us in some definitions, because I know I'm throwing different terms out there. I'm throwing equity, I'm throwing equity mindedness, I'm throwing race conscious. So just really quick, 3 terms that I think I want to kind of familiarize ourselves with. So when we're talking about equity, I'm sure really what we're talking about is, in this context, is looking at parity, achieving parity in student achievement outcomes, regardless of race and ethnicity. So when we're really looking at, okay, so if we're looking at completion, and we're looking at, for example, we're nearly 60% Latinx at Long Beach City College in terms of our enrollment. And when we look at who makes up our completers, is there parity between those two numbers, right? And so we're kind of examining that. When we talk about equity mindedness, this is really about a mental model, in the sense that, do our practices call attention to patterns of inequity as it relates to student outcomes? And then as an institution specifically and personally, are we taking responsibility to address these disparities? And so it's really looking inward and not putting the blame on students. I remember early in my career, there was a lot of student blaming, when there would be what we would used to call achievement gaps. And it was really easy to blame the student. Oh, they come from the high school and they're underprepared, or their parents don't value education. These were some of the things I would hear thrown around. And so I think for me, this introduction of equity mindedness is really important, because it gives people a mental model to think about in terms of how we address, like I said, these patterns of inequity. And then the third term I think is really important because I think it takes us to a higher level, because without the intentionality, I think you can fall into a pattern of equity mindedness or equity practices that are colorblind, and that is race consciousness. And this is this awareness in which social and historical contexts of exclusionary practices have existed in American higher education, and that have really been put in place to oppress and minoritize individuals based on race. And so we recognize that in a very unapologetic way, that we need to be talking about Black student success at Long Beach City College. We need to be talking about Latinx student success at Long Beach City College. I oftentimes tell folks, if we look at those two groups, they make up almost 75% of the students at Long Beach City College. And they are the two groups that essentially have the largest disproportionate impact in terms of these success outcomes. So if we're not talking about Latinx student success, if we're not talking about Black student success, we're not having a conversation about student success at all at Long Beach City College, because they drive the mean, they drive the averages for these outcomes. So it's really important that we have to move beyond talking about just student success, but specifically about Black student success and about Latinx student success. Because if we don't, then essentially, again, we're falling to what I believe is this trap of colorblindness that oftentimes does not get to the root issues of some of these problems. So let me talk you through a little bit about this framework. And just Dawn, if you give me a thumbs up, you see the framework slide? Okay, great. So like I said, I really have to commend our board of trustees because it was really through their leadership that they had the foresight to adopt this framework of reconciliation. And like I said, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And so this framework provides and offers us kind of four steps. And so the first step is this acknowledgement step. So we're acknowledging the existence of longstanding impacts of systemic racism at LBCC. So I think for us, it was like the first time, like at least at an institutional level, where we publicly said, systemic racism exists at Long Beach City College. Like we actually own it. Like it wasn't tap danced around. It wasn't kind of like, well, yes, there's some challenges. It was like, no, it's here. It's been here for a long time. And so we're going to acknowledge it. The second step was listen. And so we had to really listen to the accounts and experiences of racial injustice, inequity, and harm. And I can tell you this listening stage was very challenging. And not everybody agreed with it. We had some listening sessions with different groups. And not only, so we had listening sessions with faculty, with staff, with students. We had some additional training for administrators. And then we also broke people out by affinity groups so that folks could talk amongst themselves and we can hear some of the themes emerge. And like I said, I think it was empowering, but for some it was really difficult because on one part, if you've experienced, harm from racial injustices, to kind of share that information out in a public space can be re-traumatizing and triggering in many ways. And for those that, were not aware, from either from a point of privilege or just, not fully aware of these experiences, it was very difficult for them to hear colleagues and students share these experiences as well. So it was a very tough situation for us to navigate and manage, but it was very important and a very important step that needed to occur so that we could basically really understand these emergent themes that came through and what people were feeling and expressing around the racial injustices at Long Beach City College. The third step is this framework, and the framework is called convene. And it's where you really begin to bring the stakeholders and you bring people together to really begin to reflect upon what we heard in the listening sessions and then really shape these reform ideas. And then lastly is this fourth step, which is called catalyze action. And this is where you begin to say, okay, we've gone through these stages, we've heard people, we've convened people. Now, what do we want to do? And so you really start to put in those actionable steps. And not just actionable steps, but steps that you're going to hold yourself accountable to with clear metrics and ways to measure impact. And so that's essentially the framework that we're moving through at Long Beach City College. And so again, really in the backdrop is this framework that's helping us, like I said, guiding us through this kind of stage process as we really begin to embark on this catalyzing action stage. So again, not to spend too much time, but I really believe in giving people tools. Like I said, I don't want to just talk at you for 40 minutes. I want you to think about hopefully what you're hearing today and how you can connect it to your own work. And so for us at Long Beach City College, we had these 4 guiding principles that I think really helped us as we began to think about our design of racial equity work. So the first, we felt it was very important to align our efforts. There's an alphabet soup of programs, activities, plans on our campuses. And so it's really important to think about the Chancellor's Office Vision for Success, our own strategic planning process, our equity plans, our guided pathways. We have this framework for reconciliation. We're about to implement a new strategic plan. So how does all of this align, and how do we do it in a way where equity is not an afterthought, and racial equity specifically is not an afterthought, and it's not just something that runs alongside what we do, but it is core and central to every parts of our planning processes at the institution. So it becomes embedded in our culture and our organization. The second piece was really engaging with intentionality. And that's the part where I mentioned earlier about kind of that shift from colorblindness to race consciousness, is that you have to be intentional about engaging in race conscious practices. It often isn't the default strategy. And so you have to call it out. You have to call it out when you're looking at the data. You have to call it out when you're designing your activities and your strategies. You have to call it out in the evaluation so that you're not just getting these dashboards that are only looking at all students in terms of success, but you're disaggregating that data by race and ethnicity, gender, and other other student groups who experience disproportionate impact. So we're really just understanding the full picture. The fourth principle is this kind of idea of grounding our decisions in data. It's very important that I have to say, the most powerful tool I think we have is our process of inquiry. And so we have to really begin to use a race conscious process of inquiry in terms of identifying gaps, as well as really driving our decision making so that we are implementing the most high impact practices as possible. And then lastly, collaboration. We are a human-centered organization. We're not in the corporate world. Human beings, people are at the core and center of everything we do. We work in a shared governance environment. So it's really important that we build this model in a way that is collaborative and that really integrates our equity practices across all of our employee groups, all of our student groups on campus. And so it's really important, that collaboration stage. So now what I like to do is I kind of give you this framing, right? And we talked about, this journey of, this awakening, right? We had this aha moment coming out of the USC equity plan and saying, okay, wait a minute, this plan is great, but it's very colorblind. So now we're having these conversations about what does it mean to be more race conscious, and then we have the backdrop of, the awakening around racial injustices as a result of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor that fueled more conversations on our campus. We've now implemented a framework for reconciliation. So you have this kind of high level, right, understanding what's been happening at Long Beach City College. But I think it's really important that we drill down to the ground. Okay, so yes, these frameworks, these strategies, these conversations are all important. But again, how does it translate into practice? Okay, and so for me, what I want to do is kind of offer you some strategies, right? Some tools, and then more importantly, share with you the impact that we discovered as we implemented some of these strategies. And I think it's important to know from my perspective that I always tell folks things like, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And what I mean by that is sometimes when we're talking about transformational change and we're talking about racial equity, we get stuck. And I almost call it like paralysis by analysis. Like we think too much about something and it's hard to move into the action stage of this work. And what I've discovered is that sometimes we want to address every single barrier or every single issue that we can't get out of our own way. So I always tell folks, let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to be okay with, to some extent, experimenting different strategies, different approaches, measuring its impact. Some of it's going to work. Some of it may not work. And that's okay. There's value in learning from that. And so it's really, for me, it's about, okay, are we, I will never be disappointed in our team if we, put a strategy forward and it didn't work. Because I think it takes a lot of courage to break away from the status quo and to try something different, right? especially if what we're trying to do is intended to create an impact for our students and our campus community. So really, for me, it's about, okay, how do we have conversations? How do we ideate ideas and strategies together that will hopefully address some of these longstanding barriers that we know our students have faced and are experiencing? So we identified these kind of focus areas for us at Long Beach City College, and really thinking about, okay, what equity-minded and race-conscious strategies do we want to implement around these kind of 5 focus areas? So we really started thinking about enrollment. And, Long Beach City College is nationally known for being one of the partners with the Long Beach College Promise. And so we get a lot of recognition around the Long Beach College Promise, and it is groundbreaking, and it's a very important model for our college or institution. It became the template for the state's California Promise. So yes, it's very important, but even within the promise, as powerful of a model it is, there's still work that needs to be done around closing racial equity gaps in college participation for Black students, African-American students, Latinx students. And specifically, when you start to do zip code analysis and you start to see who's coming, you see a different picture. And so who's coming to Long Beach City College, I should say, you see a different picture. And so we needed to pay attention to enrollment. We also recognized that we needed to look at financial aid. Almost every retention persistence study that focuses on first-generation college students, on students of color, financial aid comes up. And oftentimes it's left out of our equity conversations. People don't see financial aid as a racial equity issue, but it really is. And I'm going to show you how and why it is and what we can do to support financial aid on our campuses. Retention and persistence is another area that obviously, when we think about the student success metric outcomes, we need to really focus on. Transfer and award completion. And then lastly, representation and leadership. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some equity-minded and race-conscious practices that I believe have really fueled a lot of the growth and impact that we've seen at Long Beach City College over the last few years. So let's talk really quickly about enrollment practices. I can't go into all the details, but there's one particular strategy that really stood out for me at Long Beach City College. And that is when we were looking at the high schools across Long Beach Unified, and we identified 2 high schools that essentially didn't have the same college participation rate at Long Beach City College and in our Long Beach College Promise. And so when we identified those 2 high schools, again, data is only as good as what you do with it. We happened to see that those high schools had a higher share of African-American and Latinx students. And they also had the highest percentages of free and reduced lunch. And so one of the things we did is we went out to the high school principals, and my team and I sat down and we reviewed the data with those 2 high school principals. And we had a conversation, and obviously they weren't happy with what they were seeing either. And so we decided to experiment, and we tried a strategy, and we said, how about we consider doing compulsory applications? That means we'll go into your econ or government classes, or maybe each high school had a different approach, but essentially we would go into all the senior classes, and we would have them apply to Long Beach City College. And then we would bring all the core services, the core matriculation services, out to their high school. So we did on-site orientation, on-site counseling for their ed plans, and we removed all those barriers, because for some of those students, they would have to take 3 buses to come to Long Beach City College and be on a bus that took over an hour to be able to do some of those matriculation steps. And so again, thinking about removing these barriers for our first-generation college students. And so through this idea of what does it mean to have culturally responsive enrollment practices, and really using the data to drive our services. And it was a tough conversation, because there are some folks that said, this is hand-holding, you're coddling. And we're like, no, this is meeting our students where they're at and being responsive to their needs. And so the other thing I heard is, how is this fair? And I always remind folks, how is this fair to some of the other high schools where you're not doing this? And I always remind folks, equity is not about sameness. Equity is not about treating everybody the same. Equity is about fairness and justice. And so if you're going to be fair and you're going to be just, you're going to recognize that there are some barriers that different communities face. And we are going to go ahead and we're going to adapt our services in a way that's race conscious and equity minded. And this is what we saw when we implemented these strategies. we saw tremendous gains in enrollment at Long Beach City College and in the Long Beach College Promise. And again, this is pre-pandemic, as you know, and I'm very transparent with the good and the bad in data. I don't believe in just telling a rosy story. I think the negative data is important to be transparent with. And maybe not negative data, let me pick a better word, the data where that there's opportunities to improve. And I think we've all known that as a result of the pandemic, we've been experiencing different declines in student enrollment at the community college level. So for this presentation, this is really focusing on leading up to the pandemic. But we saw a 35% increase in enrollment for Latinx students, 21% increase for Asian Pacific Islander and DESI students, and a 13% increase in Black and African American students. So the student populations that were, historically underrepresented at Long Beach City College, again, those racial equity gaps that we were seeing in terms of college participation started to disappear. And now we have parity between, or close to parity, between some of the different racial ethnic groups in Long Beach Unified that feed into us and our enrollment patterns at Long Beach City College. And that's a really important marker. The other thing I think that's very powerful is understanding the different pieces in the data and in the research that correlate with different student success outcomes. So for us at Long Beach City College, what we discovered in our enrollment model is the most predictive indicator of a student becoming fully enrolled at Long Beach City College was having a comprehensive ed plan. So if you had a comprehensive ed plan before you enroll at Long Beach City College, you were significantly more likely to enroll than any other of the matriculation steps. So we really ramped up our counseling services, and we increased comprehensive ed plans by 98% for African American and Black students and 84% for Latinx students. So again, we really do believe the restructuring of this model, taking core services out to the high school, being race conscious and intentional about closing these gaps, looking at the strategies that are most correlated, are the most connected to successful outcomes in enrollment. This is the model we built, right? And so we completely redesigned matriculation. And I know there's 2 EDD students in this room probably that I have to give a shout out to because they were instrumental in this whole redesign process, and that's Sonia de la Torre and Elijah Sims. Elijah was the matriculation coordinator. Sonia was the associate dean over the area. And so they're really responsible for, along with a whole team of other folks, for really this transformational work happening at Long Beach City College as it relates to these enrollment practices. Financial aid. I'm going to move through this quickly because I want to make sure that I have time for questions. But, we really, again, I've oftentimes, said, student financial aid is a racial equity issue. If you really listen and understand the lived experience of many of our students of color, oftentimes one of the things that pulls them away from their educational journey is the need to work. And so when I arrived at Long Beach City College, I was asking different questions. And one of the things that I discovered was that we were returning close to or over $200,000 of unspent federal work study. And it got me thinking, and I started asking questions to other colleagues and other vice presidents in the region. And we all kind of just, this was kind of happening under the radar, realized that a lot of schools were returning a large sum of unspent federal work study dollars. And so that just didn't make sense to me in thinking about, so many of our Black and Brown students, would share with me, and I know this is anecdotal, but when I would be speaking to them or they're saying, Dr. Mike, I'm going to take a break, I need to go work, or I need to increase my hours. And it's like, we should have more jobs on campus and we have the money to do it. And so we again took a very race conscious approach to our financial aid processes and being intentional about recruiting young men of color into federal work study opportunities, expanding the federal work studies opportunities on campus. And so I want to share with you some of the outcomes we saw as a result of this. And so first thing that I'm really excited to say when we think about our business processes in financial aid and how we've been really targeting our African-American, Black, and Latinx students, we've seen tremendous growth. So we've seen successful FAFSA completion by 27% for our Latinx students. We've seen a 33% increase in federal work study for Asian students over the last year. I'm really proud of this figure for our Cal Grant students. We've distributed, for our African-American students, we've distributed Cal Grants by an increase of 63% from 2018 to 2021, huge number. a 1,705% increase in emergency student aid to Black students on campus. Again, being very race conscious during the pandemic as we've been delivering emergency student aid as a result of HER funding, and recognizing that through our own data collection process at Long Beach City College, the student groups that have been most disproportionately impacted have been our African-American Black students. And so being very conscious in delivery of those funds to those students, and 212% increase in emergency student aid distribution to Latinx students as well. So we're very proud of these outcomes because, again, we've been very conscious about, okay, who has been most impacted by this pandemic, what student groups are in most need, and directing that aid towards them. So thinking about re-engagement grants, thinking about continuation grants. So again, obviously we don't discriminate, and it's not you got the grant because you're African American or Latinx, but again, it's looking at these different data buckets and saying, okay, we have students who are under enrolling. Who are they? And let's target them with some supports. And then we know that those students who are under enrolling happen to be overwhelmingly students of color. Who's not continuing from fall to spring semester? Put that in a bucket and start looking at that student group a little bit more deeply. Well, they happen to be overwhelmingly students of color. Okay, let's direct some additional support to those students to support them continuing from fall to spring. So these are kind of the creative ways we've been thinking and using this data in a race-conscious way to really drive supports in a way that's responsive and socially just. Again, in the areas of retention and persistence, I have to give a big shout out to our faculty. And I need to pause here because we talk a lot about success outcomes as it relates to enrollment, persistence, completion, but there's something else missing from that model. And that is our institutional culture and climate, and how are we affirming and validating our students as well in terms of their own lived experiences and their own identities. And so one of the things our faculty has done at a scale that I don't think any other college in California has really done is they have implemented a cultural curriculum audit. And this isn't like a one day, one thing. Like it is a very comprehensive process in which they essentially examine their syllabus and create an equity-minded syllabus. They look at their curriculum. They read articles. They have to redesign an assignment. I mean, it's very intensive. And so they're looking at their pedagogy, they're looking at their curriculum, they're looking at their syllabus, they're being self-reflective. And it's just such a powerful model. And I really just, again, cannot express my gratitude enough to the faculty for really taking this on and championing this cultural curriculum audit. And like I said, Long Beach City College has been seen essentially as a statewide leader in this work because we've had close to 300 faculty members complete the cultural curriculum audit since it's been implemented over the last 3 years. So it's, again, very transformational, impactful model. So what are we seeing in terms of the outcomes, in terms of retention and persistence? We're seeing that we've had 306 full-time and part-time faculty participate in the cultural curriculum audit. So again, giving folks tools to think about equity in their classroom and how it relates to them. So not talking about equity up here at the 20,000 foot level, but really drilling down and how do you take these concepts and apply them into your instructional practices every day, right? Also looking at in terms of just increases really quickly, you can see in terms of transferable units over the last 10 years, we've seen a 255% increase for Black and African American students, a 242% increase for Latinx students. When we look at the implementation of our first year experience program, you can see we've grown it exponentially. So everything we're doing at Long Beach City College is designed in a way to be at scale. So it's not boutique programs, and not to take anything away from boutique programs because they're important and they exist for a reason and we still have them. But also how can we design some of our systems and supports in a way that's scalable? And so you can see we started in 2019 with 2,700 students. This past fall, we're serving over 4,700 students, one of the largest FYE programs in the state. So again, being very deliberate and conscious about how we serve our students and making sure we do it at scale. Again, at the statewide level, we've gone through some major changes and reforms around developmental education. And so you can see the increases here. And I'm really proud of, again, the faculty for taking on the implementation of, AB 705 and, the increases we're seeing in transfer level English and the completion of transfer level English and the completion of transfer level math in the first year. And you can see, again, outstanding results as it relates to and again, remember what I said at the beginning, we're not talking about Black student success. We're not talking about Latinx student success. We're not talking about student success at LVCC, because these two students groups historically have had the largest disproportionate impact as it relates to those outcomes. And they also are the student groups that drive the averages and mean for the college. So you could see here, again, tremendous growth. And then, I do want to talk about one more strategy, and then I'm going to wind down because I want to be able to have time for questions and answers. But again, around transfer and completion, one of the things that we saw was the need to really have a conversation about what does it mean to focus on completion counseling. And so we implemented a completion counseling case management model where we essentially did data mining and we did unit analysis, and we found, students who were sitting between 45 and 60 units and students who were in 60 unit plus, and we case loaded them. But we prioritized them by student groups who are most disproportionately impacted. And again, that was our African-American males, our Latino males. And so we found that it was really important to essentially build a model, again, that was race conscious. So of course we serve every student in this model, but how we, work with students within those caseloads, we were culturally responsive and intentional. And so again, we saw tremendous outcomes around completion. So just to show you, in terms of the overall gains in degree completion or transfer within 1 year of hitting 45 units, we saw a 39% increase for Black and African-American students, a 47% increase for Latinx students, and a 42% increase for Asian Pacific Islander and DESI students. So again, being intentional about who we serve and how we serve them, we're closing these gaps, we're increasing student success. And I'm really proud to share, we're getting closer to seeing parity in terms of our completion numbers than we've ever seen before. Our Latinx students, I think this past year, our Latinx students are now no longer having disproportionate impact in terms of the awards of associate degrees for transfer. So again, never have happened in the history of the college, right? But we're seeing these gaps close, and we're really proud of it, of the work that's happening. So in closing, before I open up for questions, I just want to say, we've talked a lot about success metrics and strategies, and I kind of wanted to, offer you tools to think about how can, some of these strategies, because it isn't a one size fits all, right? It's thinking about how can some of these strategies be applied at your institution, or, hopefully it's just getting you to think a little bit more deeply about how you can make the data actionable on your campus, the equity data. But in closing, I do want to touch upon this, and that is, our commitment to diverse representation and inclusion. It's really important that, we are in a historic moment in the California community college system. And I just think in higher ed in general, that there is a lot of hiring that's happening. And we're hiring 40 tenure track faculty members this coming spring. It's a huge opportunity to shape, right, the institution. And so just really our commitment to diverse representation in employees and adjusting campus culture and climate is also very important in these conversations. I can't stress it enough. It's not just enough to focus on success outcomes. You have to also think about the mental models that people bring with them into the organization and the culture and the culture climate that you're building on campus. And so again, we've been really committed to diverse representation in our hiring pools, as well as, being intentional about implementing strategies that will improve the campus culture and climate. So then just in closing, just show you some quick things. We've seen some tremendous outcomes in the hiring of diverse faculty. So this past fall's 2021 faculty cohort was 100% new faculty of color. That was the first time I think we saw something like that. 93% of our faculty interns are faculty of color at Long Beach City College. And then just looking at some of the other employee groups, in 2020, 89% of permanent administrators hired in that year were identified as BIPOC. And in 94% of classified professionals hired identified as BIPOC. So again, big shout out to Human Resources and the Personnel Commission and folks have been working really hard to focus on representation. We're seeing that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I know I've talked at you for about 45 minutes now, and that was my marching orders. So I wanted to again walk you through again our journey at Long Beach City College and share with you just some points of reflection as well as points of opportunities that we experienced. So I'm really again humbled to be here, and so at this point I'll pause and turn it back over to Dr. Haviland or Amy, whoever is going to kind of shout out the questions.
Great. Dr. Munoz, that's wonderful. I don't know what you can see. There's all sorts of applause on the screen, and I was watching the chat. It was lighting up with kudos for the work that you're all doing at Long Beach City College. And they quote just some of the terms, just the enthusiasm, the respect. Somebody described it as material anti-racism, right? It's actually doing the work. And so thank you so much for taking the time. You don't all know this, Dr. Munoz actually adjusted his schedule to be with us today. And we're so thankful that you did. So thanks so much, Dr. Munoz. So we do have time until about 10:15 for questions. Probably easiest, and raise your hand go into the reactions button at the bottom of the screen and raise your hand, and we can call on you, and I think you'll be able to unmute. I'll try also to watch the chat, but I think it's easy to manage if you just want to raise your hand and you can unmute and ask Dr. Munoz yourself. Floor for questions. Just from the response in chat, I know there must be some questions.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, Terry Armstrong. Thanks, Terry.
No problem. Hi, Dr. Munoz. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation and all the great work that you're doing over at Long Beach City College. It sounds very admirable. I do have a question in regards to your equity practices. How do your equity practices transfer into your hiring practices as you address underrepresentation of faculty when of color does not necessarily equate to higher representation, specifically of African American, Native American, and/or Pacific Islander faculty?
That's a really good question. So I think to your point, we have to really be intentional in our hiring practices. And so one of the things that the faculty have done, and I want to commend them because they took a big leadership role in this, is they redesigned their faculty internship program to be focused on a faculty diversity internship program. So there was a traditional model that existed within their contract in their collective bargaining agreement that we supported, as an institution. And they took it upon themselves to say in a reflective way that we need to redesign this model so that we are intentional about building a pipeline of highly qualified faculty members that reflect the populations we serve at Long Beach City College. And so, like I said, when you look at the faculty internship program that's been implemented, you see that shift happen in terms of the representation. The other thing we've done that's been really important is we've worked with USC Center for Race and Equity, as well as the Center for Urban Education on specifically around hiring of diverse faculty. I work really closely with Dr. Sean Harper, and he's been him and his team, along with Dr. Stella Ben-Simon, have been really instrumental in sitting down with leadership at Long Beach City College in human resources, as well as our collective bargaining partners. And we've, essentially went through some very intense trainings so that we've redesigned our processes so that we are not, that we're more aware as an institution of the implicit or explicit conscious bias that occurs and putting in different strategies to mitigate that. I think we've implemented like 16 strategies specifically to help change that. And as I mentioned, we're seeing that translate into more diverse hiring. So it's not just diverse pools, but does it actually translate into a more diverse hiring class, right? And so across all groups, we're seeing that. And so it's not perfect. And, we are limited in some ways because of the ban on affirmative action, but there's ways that you can be intentional. And one of the things that I actually do, and I'll close with this, and I don't know if I should throw this out there because I'm giving away one of the interview questions, but essentially, when I do my final interview with faculty, and again, last year was my first year as president, kind of going through that process. I ask specifically, I share our equity gap in terms of course success for Black students and for Latinx students, specifically Black males, especially. I drill down on that. And I ask them, tell me specifically, what strategies are you going to use in the classroom to address that equity gap. And that is probably one of the questions that I care most about when I'm screening, when I'm hearing from applicants. And so, we're all the way from the types of questions we're asking, right, too. And so again, making sure that those that we hire are equity minded, and that they're prepared, right, to serve the diverse students of Long Beach City College. So I hope that answers part of your question. It doesn't address all of it, but because there's still more work that needs to happen. But those are some of the things that we're doing specifically right now to improve, the diverse hiring of our faculty and staff and administrators.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Munoz. And it looks like we got Dr. Ortiz. We have time at least for Dr. Ortiz and maybe for Dr. Jones. We'll see. So Dr. Ortiz.
Dr.
Hi,
Ortiz.
President, Superintendent Munoz. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you, Dr. Ortiz.
One of the things I was most proud about I think you were interim at the time, was the decision to provide shelter for your housing insecure students in the parking lot, in the parking garage. And I just really felt that was one of the bravest leadership moves I've seen. I hadn't heard of that before. And I'm wondering about how you came, I came to that decision, but what was some of the pushback, and then how did you strategize around that?
So, I always say it takes a village to really, create the type of change we're trying to make at Long Beach City College. And so I will have to say, the conversation started with our board. And, as a president, you have to be able to work with different leadership groups on campus. And so for me, it started with our board, and our board saying, we need to do more. So it wasn't necessarily the board directed and said this needed to happen, but they were asking questions. How are we serving students? We layered in. So once I knew I had, an openness from the board to move in this direction, we layered in the data, right? And we saw what was happening as a result of the pandemic and these gaps worsening for students in terms of housing and food insecurity. So we knew these gaps always existed around housing and food insecurity, but the pandemic put a spotlight on it, because we all remember the images of the little kids sitting in Taco Bell trying to do their homework, right? So the pandemic put a spotlight on it, and it also exacerbated the problem. So I think what happened, and again, going back to, okay, we have all this new data, what do we do with it? And so it was a conversation at the cabinet level, and it was uncomfortable because, and this isn't when there's resistance, it's not necessarily about like, oh, I don't support this in theory. It's like, there's legal aspects to this. There's liability, there's exposure, there's, and so it's not when, we can't vilify when there's resistance. It's not, coming from a place of not wanting to support students. It's just, this issue is very complex. And so what we did is we sat down and said, okay, yes, there's legal liability, exposure issues, all these things, but what can we do to mitigate those things so we can come up with a model that allows for this work to move forward? And so I sat down for a couple of hours with an attorney, and we talked through different scenarios, and we said, okay, well, let's bring in Safe Park LA. There's organizations and municipalities and churches that have been doing this for years. Let them guide us. Let's bring in security. Let's bring in, let's pick the parking structure that can be fully secured so that people can't just walk up and approach a student. So we made some very intentional decisions on how we approach it. And so then it didn't seem so unreachable or so unattainable. Whereas before, when those conversations occurred, it's like, no, that's mission creep. That's not our job. That's not our role. Too much risk, too much exposure. It's like, no, we really took the time to unpack all these issues, and we realized, like, what, we can do this. And lastly, I will say, for me, it was like, I'm a big believer of piloting strategies. And from my perspective, I just offered how about it's a pilot? So we started with a small manageable number, 15, right? 15 students, even though we have the capacity to do more. We're starting with this number because it was a number that was manageable. We could study it, learn from it, and if all the sky was falling, things that people thought would happen, then we could pull back, but those things so far haven't happened, right? And so we're realizing we can do this. So, those were, just to walk you through the leadership kind of thought processes. That's how we approached it. And, I think at the end of the day, I will say for those of us, because all of us are leaders in whatever capacity we're in, I really do believe, we worked hard to get into these roles because we want to create the change and impact that we think our students deserve. So just sometimes have to jump. and learn from, and like I said, we're learning from these new strategies. And so that's what I would offer.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. I think it really is transformational, and I would encourage you and your team to write up a quick case study on those measures so that others can learn from them, because like just what you described right now is a great lesson in leadership. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O.
So Dr. Munoz, thank you so much. We're running right up on time. I wish we had time for more questions. You've given us so much to think about. And I think I'm watching the chat. You've energized and you've inspired, but you've also given us very, very concrete examples and models that we can use in our own work going forward. And I think for either one of those things to happen in a presentation is wonderful. For both of them to happen together, thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom. One of the many things that I really appreciate about you as a leader is your creativity, use it for students, and your recognition of the we. I think that's all part of what makes you such a tremendous and effective leader. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Evelyn. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And we did record this, so we will have this up. I know that we've got a 10:20 start time for the next session. Sorry about that. I hope you can take Dr. Munoz's insights and ideas and wisdoms and bring those into the sessions that you're doing the rest of the morning. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kim, and she'll walk you through a couple of logistical things. I think I'm turning it over to Kim. Give me a second. So I think I do know that we're not coming back together. So afterwards, you'll have your sessions. Oh, Kim texted me and said she's frozen. So I'll try to fill in here. You should have gotten the information, the link to the program. I think I can put that drop it in the link here in the chat. Let's see here. You should be able to navigate among the breakout rooms from the website on the program. This room will stay open, I believe. So if you're having technical difficulties, you can bop back in here. Kim and Oscar will be here throughout, I believe. I think Oscar's stepping out to one of the rooms. Kim will be here, and I'll be bouncing around. I'll be able to get to see each of your sessions, which I'm super excited about. And I'm looking to see, I think Kim's still frozen. So we can always chat out messages to folks in the breakout rooms too, or in the different rooms as well. So I think at this point, stretch your legs, maybe refill your coffee or your water, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the 10:20 sessions.